Thank you again for joining us, the Zionist Federation of the UK and Ireland and the World Zionist Organization in the UK. Tonight's subject is very much in demand, and it seems like it's changing from day to day. So please note that just a couple of house rules. You are more than welcome to put your video on, but we have muted you all so that we can draw the focus to our esteemed speaker this evening, Rabbi Dov Lipman, and to minimize any vocal interruptions. There will be opportunity for you to ask all the questions that you want by submitting them in the chat section of this Zoom. As for those of you who have joined us before, you know the process, and for those who haven't, any questions you have during the evening, please do just submit them in the chat, and we will endeavour to present as many of them as possible to Rabbi Lipman. Although please bear in mind, obviously, that he and everyone else, we have time constraints. But most importantly, and unfortunately, we don't have Rabbi Lipman with us for hours and hours. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. There's people coming into the waiting room. Dalia, Dima, can you let them in as and when they arrive? But for those of you who are here already with us, Rabbi Dov Lipman was elected to the 19th Knesset in 2013, and that making him the first American-born member of Knesset in nearly 30 years. He's an author. He's an author of 8 books about Judaism in Israel, and he holds a rabbinic ordination from Ner Israel Rabbinic College and a master's in education from Johns Hopkins University. He moved to Israel from Silver Spring, Maryland in July 2004 with his wife Dina, and has 4 children, and they live in Bet Shemesh. In June 2021, the former Knesset member, Rabbi Dov Lipman, founded an organization called Yad L'Olim, which, as I understand in Hebrew, means a hand for immigrants. And it's an NGO, an Israeli NGO, which assists new immigrants with their acclimation to Israel and lobbies the Knesset on behalf of the immigration population. He also serves as a political commentator for ILTV and I24 News, and as a columnist for the Jerusalem Post and the Times of Israel. In recent weeks, Rabbi Lipman has really helped lots of families of Olim successfully get permits to enter Israel. With the new government guidelines and making the UK a red country, we are very keen to find out what the options are of all of us seeing our families who reside in Israel in the coming months. I must say at this stage, and I think my colleague Dima will share it in the chat, that even this morning, as I understand, the Health Ministry made some updates and announcements. So Dima, if you can you please share those in the chat facility? And in the meantime, just a little bit more about Yad L'Olim, and then I shall pass over to our guest of the evening. As I said before, Yad L'Olim its mission is to help Olim, immigrants, thrive in Israel. And this begins with helping them navigate Israel's complicated bureaucracies to ensure that Israel's new immigrants gain access to all basic services, benefits, and rights to which they are entitled. Yad L'Olim creates a support system for immigrants, developing new networks of professional advisors and assisting with gaining Israeli business know-how. Within government, Yad L'Olim serves as a lobbying body to the Knesset to drive government policies that provide new Olim immigrants with the tools that they need to succeed in Israel. Yad L'Olim raises the voice of immigrants and their families in the halls of government and empowers Olim to have an impact on Israeli policy and the direction of the Jewish state. So without further ado, Rabbi Dov Lipman, I hand the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. I know everyone's very anxious to understand exactly what's happening with all the rules and the regulations, and we're going to get to that. But before we do, I think it's important for me to introduce 2 women who have been essential partners in the work that we're doing in Yad L'Olim and helping people either to get approvals or get their documents in order. And I actually have to introduce them now so they can get back to their computers because they're being so inundated with people asking for assistance. So I'm going to ask if we can highlight, I'll just do one at a time. I will start with Maureen Ash. If she can be highlighted, please, by the technical staff, that would be fantastic. Maureen has been for many, many months working very hard to help Olim's families all around the world. I'll give her the minute to introduce herself. And it's important for everyone to know who Maureen is because when you write to Yad L'Olim for assistance, Maureen is likely, either Maureen or Ariella, who you meet in a moment, will be one of the people that you'll be interfacing with. So we thought it was important for you to see who you're going to be talking with. So Maureen, I'll give it to you to do to everyone.
Hi, my name is Maureen Ash. I'm currently in Chicago, Illinois. I've had a couple of stops in the States along the way. I recently made Aliyah, although I am a non-resident Israeli. I am the US, or I guess worldwide, liaison for Yad L'Olim. I've been involved with families of Olim since my own child made Aliyah. At this point, since I remarried recently, and we together have 4 children in Israel and trying to remember, 8 or 9 grandchildren there. And Israel is very important to me, obviously, and to our entire family. And I'm available to help you in any way. And just so you know, at the end of this, if any of you through Yad L'Olim are interested, we have a WhatsApp chat for UK families, and that's been also very helpful.
So what we'll do is we'll make sure to share that WhatsApp chat with the Zionist Federation so they could share it with those people who registered for tonight. And Maureen, thank you so much for all the work that you're doing. If we could spotlight Ariella, please, Ariella Bernstein. That would be great. Okay, Ariella also, by the way, has been doing her own work for Olim for a long time, including writing a book about Olim and a website for Olim. I'll let Ariella introduce herself, but she's the other person behind the scenes, so to speak, who you might be interfacing with on the Yad L'Olim site for Corona travel help. Ariella, the floor is yours. We can't hear Ariella. If she could be unmuted. Ariella still on mute. Give it one more. Ariella, can you unmute yourself? Okay, it's not working.
Just bear with me.
In the meantime, until I see it go on mute, we're going to.
Okay, there I am. They just let me on. I'll take even less time since it was a minute of technological. Thanks, Dov. My name is Ariella Bernstein. Actually, Maureen and I never met each other until about 2-3 weeks ago when she came here. She asked me to join a bunch of the WhatsApp groups that she has. My husband and I made Aliyah in, I guess it's just about 12 years ago. We have 3 children, one who lives in Boca Raton with all of our grandchildren. So like the rest of you who had tremendous difficulty getting to see your grandchildren, I have it the other way. I have parents who still live in New York, so I have that complication, and I have 2 children who live here, one who finished the Air Force fairly recently, after 5 years, was in the Army. And we've been doing this for quite some time. We sort of try to hack what was going on in Misrad on this side, and I'm fluent in Hebrew, and so I'm able to sort of manage that side of things, and it works sort of very well together. So I'm one of the people you'll hear from. It's either me, Maureen, or Rachel. Those are the 3 of us that answer emails until God knows what hour of the morning.
Thank you so much, Ariella. And thank you again, Ariella and Maureen, for all that you're doing for Yad L'Olim and for people all around the world who are trying to get travel into Israel. If you can bring the spotlight back, that would be fantastic. And we'll continue onwards. So, Stephen, if you want to bring it back to me, that would be great. And I'm going to get started with the presentation for everyone. So I know there's been a lot of discussion about the UK in particular. I know that who's our audience tonight, and we are going to focus very much on the United Kingdom. What I'm going to do is as follows. First, I want to just mention a little bit of a development that took place today, and we'll see where we're going in terms of Friday. The government of Israel has made a decision that the United Kingdom will be one of the countries that are viewed as a high-risk country. And that status will go into place the night between this coming Thursday and Friday at 12 a.m. That is the plan according to the government. Now, I'm going to mention one caveat, but then I'm going to continue assuming that that will take place. You might be seeing in the news a development in the Knesset. I was at the Knesset today and saw a little bit of behind the scenes about this issue. The chairman of the Knesset Law Committee, Gilad Kariv, has said that he will not bring that decision of the government to a vote of his committee, which must verify the government's decision, because he doesn't feel the government is doing enough in terms of enforcing quarantine rules for all travelers who are coming to Israel. And he feels that it's unfair to just make a decision about another country like the UK, where there's so much travel back and forth, if Israel's not even taking the basic rules as seriously as he would like to see for those travelers who are coming back, both Israeli and non-Israeli. And therefore, he refused to bring this decision of the government to a vote in the committee today. What does that mean? That means the Knesset has 48 hours in order to vote on this decision, or it will not go into place this coming Friday. It doesn't mean that it won't come into place the next Sunday or Tuesday or Thursday, but there's some internal politics taking. So you might hear about some questioning, will it really happen in terms of the UK, will it not? Just remember, that's dependent on the Knesset making this decision. But we're going to move forward with tonight's program, assuming that the decision will be made, whether it's Friday or a later date. I did speak with the health ministry officials today, and they are absolutely determined, based on the numbers they're seeing in the UK, that this will be the policy. So based on that, I want to just lay out a few basic ideas for all of you to understand what the policy will be in that situation. So let's just a moment. It happens July 30th at 12 a.m. The UK will become a country of a high risk. And that means, as a general rule, Israelis will be barred from traveling to there as a general rule. And as a general rule, it means that foreigners are barred from entering Israel. That's the basic premise that we have to work with. Now, we'll go through exactly how that plays out, but that's the mindset that everyone has to get into. And I really want to take a moment before I go even further, because I know I've seen it in my own inbox, and I'm sure more also, and anyone involved in this issue. There's a lot of anger, there's a lot of sadness, and I can understand all of it. At the same time, I can also understand the Israeli government officials who are responsible ultimately for the situation on the ground here in Israel. And if they see numbers rising in terms of seriously ill, those who are connected to ventilators, etc., they're the ones who, a few weeks from now, if the hospitals are filled again, and if God forbid we're having deaths, it's on their shoulders. And therefore, they're constantly trying to balance all of this together. And as they're getting the information about what's happening in other countries, make their decisions based on that. Just understand, it's not a decision that's made with any kind of, not only not happiness, but it's made with sadness, and it's made with pain, understanding that families are being torn apart on a certain level, or kept far away from each other, I should say, as a result of this. So right now, people are going through the process of asking for approvals. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. But you might, for example, ask for an approval today. Your flight is next week, and you might get that approval through the process. You're visiting a first-degree relative or the like. It's important to understand that the moment the UK or the other countries included that are determined to be high-risk countries, the moment that happens, any approvals that you receive beforehand for a trip that's taking place after it comes into play, that approval is nullified. At that point, the approval does not count. So this is an issue which we had with South Africa, and that's why I want to emphasize. When South Africa became a high-risk country, I believe it was February 1st, there were people who had approvals from a few days beforehand for a trip after February 1st. And those approvals are not accepted. And therefore, it's very important to realize that obviously these next few days, there might be approvals for people who are traveling just these next few days. But beyond that, the approvals that you get now for after July 30th starting, those approvals will not be accepted at that point. Once the UK becomes a country of high risk, or any other country that becomes a country of high risk, Israelis who were there beforehand, okay, you might have Israeli relatives who are there right now, they are allowed to return to Israel. They are allowed, they traveled to UK in a permitted fashion before it became a high-risk country. They are allowed to return back to Israel, but please take note, they will be required to do the quarantine, to go to, even if they're recovered, even if they've been vaccinated, it's no questions asked. A person who's coming into Israel, once this status comes into play, they have to go into quarantine. What is that quarantine? And I want to say this very, very carefully so that everybody can understand exactly what it is, because you're going to see this terminology in various websites. It's officially called a 14-day quarantine. That's the official title that you'll see, and that number scares a lot of people. That's the official status. However, Israel has changed recently, and they've said you are able to reduce that to 7 days. You're going to have a PCR test, that person, when they arrive in Israel, they take a PCR test on the 7th day and enables the person to leave from quarantine after those 7 days. That's called a full quarantine, and that's going to apply to everybody in this discussion about the UK becoming a high-risk country. So, Israeli travelers at this stage, they will not have to go into any kind of a quarantine hotel. They will not. They can quarantine in a home where they have their own room, they have their own bathroom. They are allowed to quarantine in that manner. We're talking about Israelis who are returning to Israel after the UK becomes this high-risk country. People who have visas, okay, you have people who have A-class visas, B-class visas, student visas. They do not have the right, once this goes into effect, they will not have the ability to get automatic entry into Israel. They have to apply to be able to come to Israel. I'll post on my Facebook tonight again. We'll put it on the Facebook group, Reunite Olim with Families, exactly what the links are, just to make sure everybody knows. But the current link that is in place to ask for the right to come to Israel via the consulate, that is the link that you will have to use if you have a student visa, if you have a A-class visa, a B visa. You have to use the regular link and ask for approval. The health ministry official who I spoke to today asked me to make it very clear that there are going to be very few approvals given in that area, especially, he emphasized, when it comes to student visas. Whereas now student visas are actually allowed to enter. The student visas, they will be very strict about. And I know I've gotten many messages from people who have students, children coming to yeshiva or seminary or gap year programs. That's all being thrown into question right now. I know there's a lot of negotiations taking place behind the scenes. See, is there any way for it to happen? According to this health ministry, you have to assume at the moment that as long as the UK is a high-risk country, that they will not be allowed to have entry, and therefore you should be in the work making other plans for those children, at least at this point in time. If they do get approval, if it's viewed as a circumstance which is warranting of approval, I saw the question was asked, yes, any non-Israeli who comes into Israel during this status of the UK being a high-risk country, their quarantine is going to be done in a hotel. That is where that's going to be done. They want to be able to monitor everyone who comes in under that status, and therefore it cannot be home quarantine. I will say, parenthetically, but very cautiously, here and there, in very, very extreme circumstances, people were able to get approval once they were at the hotel to be able to go somewhere else based on various circumstances. But you have to assume that that quarantine will be, again, for a non-Israeli who's allowed entry into Israel, that will be done in a hotel. Exceptions in general for foreigners will be very rare. They're going to restrict it severely. If you do want to apply an exception. You do want to listen. I have an extreme circumstance. This is the reason why I have to go to Israel. There is an exceptions committee that will be receiving these applications from the regular link that you know from the consulate. And it could be, there's also a place where you can even explain why you want to come to Israel. But I want to emphasize in advance, you have to assume that if it's not a medical emergency, you have to assume if it's not something extreme that it will not be accepted. Now, many people, I've already been getting emails about it, have been asking about weddings. I'm going to use the following terminology. We have confidence that people who are making a wedding of a child during this period of time, we have confidence that the authorities will allow those people to enter Israel, but I in no way want anyone to think that it's automatic in any manner whatsoever. I will also tell you that we at Yad L'Olim on that particular issue will do whatever we can to try to help with that. We cannot promise that we can get that approval done, but we certainly will do our best to be a liaison to the authorities in that very specific situation to try to help. Certainly, again, in a medical situation, you will have to provide documentation showing that it's a medical emergency. They're not going to see an application which says medical emergency, my father, God forbid, is sick, my mother's sick. You have to be able to provide real documentation showing that it's a real need, and then the exceptions committee might accept it in that situation. The other way around, Israelis are allowed to ask for permission to travel to a high-risk country like the UK presumably will be. But again, very, very, very rare occasions that it's granted. We will post that link as well for them to be able to make that request, but you have to assume that that request is not going to be met, again, unless there's real extreme situations. I will point out, there is one way that you can sort of work around the situation, and that is, if let's say you want to come to Israel, you have a reason, you know for a fact that you have a wedding that's coming up in a month's time, let's say, there is an option. And by the way, people from South Africa have been using this option over the last few months. There is an option to travel to a country that's a green country, that's a country without risk for 2 weeks' time. And then at the end of those 2 weeks, you are allowed, again, I want to emphasize, at the end of those 2 weeks, then you can apply to enter Israel. And again, entering Israel in that situation will have to be according to the current criteria to enter Israel, which for the most part is to visit a first-degree relative. That's the basic premise that we have to be working for, a first-degree relative who is an Israeli citizen living in Israel. And then you can follow the consulate link and apply all the various documents that you must include. I'll get back to the documents in a moment. So that is one of the ways that it can be done. One other thing which I'll mention, and that is not relevant to people who are living in the UK, but people who are traveling to Israel from other countries and they have a stopover that goes through the UK or any other high-risk country, as long as that stopover or change of planes is for less than 12 hours and they do not leave the airport, at that point, you are allowed to continue on and enter into Israel with the approval that you had before. That was a lot. There was a lot of information there. I know there's a lot to digest. I will mention, if you go to the Facebook group, Reunite Olim with Families, you will see that was posted there today. And I will follow up from tonight's event, and I will post again some of the rules and some of the regulations and the like. I want to mention, just before I get to some of the more broader rules, in terms of the role that Yad L'Olim can play, and that's why it was very important to introduce Maureen and Ariella in particular. Right now, a lot of what we're doing, and a lot of what they're doing, is going over people's documentation. And this is really important to emphasize, whether or not the UK becomes a high-risk country on Friday or not, just in general, when you're applying for approval, making sure that you have proper documentation is critical. Because we find that many people aren't even being answered or being outright rejected because their documentation is not in order. And therefore, it's important to know when you're applying exactly what documentation you need. You can actually follow on the consulate website link pretty clearly what you need to have. But just to understand, what you need to have is proof of the reason why you're coming to Israel. So just as an example, if it's to visit a first-degree relative, you have to show that relationship. If it's a child, then it's a birth certificate and it's the passports of both of the people. So you have to have that. Everybody has to submit what's called an isolation affidavit, and that's available on that site. Everyone has to show that they have corona insurance that covers corona in Israel. It has to stay outright in the that you have insurance. That is one of the reasons why many people are being rejected. They're showing their own health insurance, whatever it is. We do have in our link, which I'll post later on, examples of what those insurances are. So you have to have that. You have to have your vaccination certificate. At the moment, they're not allowing people in for the most part if you're not vaccinated, or if you have a certificate of recovery showing that you had corona and you recovered. Best certainly to have that together with showing your positive test, your negative test, and the documentation from the doctor or from a medical authority. So you have to make sure that you have that documentation in place, especially if you're going via the high-risk route and you're asking for an exception. The documentation is going to be critical for that. That is a very basic overview of all the situations. The general idea is Israelis are allowed to travel. That is the general rule that exists at this point in time. There are very specific rules about Israelis who have children who are not Israeli. And again, we're going to post exactly how you have to go about doing that. Essentially, you have to begin the process of registering your child as an Israeli. You have to show that. You have to make a declaration that when you return, you're going to finish that process and show all the relevant documentation. There is an allowance for parents to visit, or family to visit their children who are lone soldiers and or doing national service. So there are situations where, again, it might be different than the basic rule of first-degree relative, but in each case, the link that we post will show you exactly what you need in those situations. What I want to do now is I want to hand it back to the moderator, because that was a lot of me speaking straight, and I know that a lot of questions have come in. I did notice one question which related to Aliyah. The information that I was given today is that Aliyah will continue. Those people who have the full approval for Aliyah, that will continue. Again, keep your eyes open for that, because that's something which the government has gone back and forth on throughout this process. I know that the Minister of Aliyah, Pnina Tamanu-Shata, fought very hard to make sure that Aliyah should continue, despite all the corona regulations and policies. And exactly how it works, the flight comes here, they go to hotels, etc. That's all going to be worked out, and you'll certainly be told that by your Aliyah advisor as well. So that's the general overview. And I'll hand it back to the moderator to be able to ask the questions that have come up.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Lipman. As you can imagine, we have lots and lots of questions, so I'll just get straight to them. Recently, there was a Haaretz article headlined, "Israel won't allow thousands of children of Israeli expats into the country." So one of our audience has asked this evening, can the speaker shed any light on the suggestion that children of citizens, Israeli citizens under the age of 28 apply for an Israeli passport without making Aliyah?
Can they apply for an Israeli passport?
No, it's, can the speaker shed any light on the suggestion that children of citizens...
So the rule right now is that if a person is an Israeli who's living overseas and their children are not Israeli, they cannot automatically assume that because they're Israeli and they're allowed to travel back to Israel, that their children, especially in this case, largely children who are not vaccinated or recovered from corona, can just travel together along with them. However, they are allowed to earn the status to travel with their parents if they begin the process of registering their children as Israeli, which means they notify the consulate officially they want to be process. They sign a declaration which says they are going to finish the process when they return from their trip to Israel. In those circumstances, at that point in time, once that has been done, the children are allowed to travel together with their parent after getting approval. I have to emphasize this point. They still need to submit all of that documentation to the consulate and then get their approval. Now, I saw some questions popping up along the way when I use the terminology "to the consulate." This is not the process that has existed for pretty much the whole last year and a half, where you sent an email into the consulate and asked for permission. There is a special dedicated link for this specifically, where it's digitalized and it has all the information there. It's in English, by the way, and you can follow it very clearly and go through the process and choose your category. There's a drop down with many, many options, and follow the process to apply for the approval. But that's how it works for an Israeli who's living overseas with children who are not Israeli at the current time.
Okay, thank you. It's a very thorough answer, and I hope satisfactory for everyone. We've got another one here. This is about the notes that my colleague Dima posted at the beginning of the session, which is, as I understand, an update that came this morning. Gentleman is asking, he's just wondering whether the above 8 or 9 points are still true or will be true by the end of the week in light of the vote 2 hours ago in the Knesset.
Okay, so I want to be clear because there's a lot of misinformation about what happened in the Knesset. There was no vote in the Knesset today, and that's actually the news. Meaning the way it works is the government makes a recommendation, makes a decision, then the parliament, which oversees the work of the government, has to give approval. And the committee, it starts in committee, and then it goes to the plenary. The chair did not bring it to a vote today because he feels that Israel has not been, in general, monitoring quarantine for those who return to Israel in a stringent enough fashion. And he feels that if they're not going to monitor the quarantine of people who are coming in, why are we all of a sudden putting out rules about other countries and sort of putting the onus in other places, the way he was sort of saying it? That does not mean that anything has changed. The Knesset has hours to go through this process in order to put the high-risk status for the UK into place by Thursday night, Friday morning at 12 a.m. So nothing is null and void. At the moment, the health ministry is determined to make sure that this happens because they feel that is what is necessary to protect Israel and Israelis. And therefore, at the moment, we are assuming that over the next 48 hours, that approval will take place. If it doesn't, we will make sure to send out those updates, but I have to imagine it'll happen at some point afterwards because the government is absolutely determined to make the status change take place at this time.
Okay, thank you. Got one from a father here. His son is a student at Na'aleh, currently back in the UK for the summer. He has a student visa valid until mid-October. They're asking the questions, considering what your notes say and suggesting that approvals would rarely be granted for those with student visas, do they need to get him back to Israel before the 29th of July?
If you're asking me, okay, and this is a very hard thing for me to answer for a very individual situation of a young boy, I would actually, if it's possible, I would actually make that recommendation at this time. I don't have a doubt that programs like Na'aleh will do what they can to work with the government and try to find solutions. But I also know that on the government side, they know that once they start making those exceptions, then the floodgates have opened and they might not be able to stop it. And the students are a real concern. So all I would say is, assuming that that child has accommodations and can be taken care of, just based on what I've heard from the health ministry officials and their specific warning about rare occasions where student visas will be granted the right to enter Israel once this status takes place, my recommendation in a very general, broad sense would be for the young man to try to get into Israel before the status change takes place.
Okay, thank you. Will Israeli citizens currently living in the UK with dual nationality be able to enter Israel after the 30th of July and leave Israel to travel back to the UK? If so, will they need to provide proof that they live in the UK?
So someone who has a valid Israeli passport is allowed to travel into Israel from a country which is a high-risk country. They do have to do the full quarantine when they come to Israel. The full quarantine, again, like we said before, is officially called 14 days with the option of reducing it to 7 days with the PCR test before and on day 7. In terms of traveling back to the UK as an Israeli citizen, they will have to make a request to be able to make that trip. And again, the health ministry official today said that they're only granted in very rare occasions. So it's not something where if someone really wants to be traveling back and forth with ease, it will not be a situation like that. And I can tell you, just in terms of our dealings with South Africa over the past half a year, it's really not a simple situation to enter into. And we don't recommend that anyone be in a place able to travel back and forth easily, because it's not a simple process to go through. And especially traveling from Israel to the high-risk country, it's very rare that the approvals will be given.
Okay, thank you for that, Rabbi Lipman. What about someone so they have no first-degree relatives in Israel, they have an apartment in Israel. What are the chances of them being given permission?
Getting that question throughout the last number of months, even without coming from a high-risk country. There is no criteria which says that because you own a property in Israel, because you have an apartment in Israel, that you're allowed to enter. That is not a basis for allowance into Israel, even before we enter into the issue of high-risk countries. So I'd have to say, certainly, when it comes to the high-risk country situation, it will not be something which would be a basis for an approval. I do want to mention, I just saw, again, the chat, there's 67 things there, but I just saw something pop up and I want to answer this. Someone asked, why haven't I mentioned the AS1 form? The AS1 form is not a form. I want to be very, very clear, because we've also been asked this question many, many times. It is not a form for people who are living outside of Israel, applying to come into Israel via the consulates. That is a form for people who live inside of Israel, who are inviting, so to speak, a relative to come and visit them via the Israeli Interior Ministry, the Misrad HaPnim. That is where that form is relevant. So for the purposes of our discussion right now, which is people outside of Israel applying to come in, and it's not the relative in Israel making that application, the AS1 form for your application via the consulate link does not apply. That form is not there, and you will not see it. You go to the link for the consulates, it doesn't exist. So don't get confused by that. Don't get confused when you don't see it. It's not a required document for when you're applying from outside of Israel in via the consulate link.
Okay. We have another member of our audience here this evening saying that besides having family in Israel, they have a court case that they need to be at in Israel. What chance of that being an exception, the court case? Does that facilitate? Does it help?
So I've received a few of those questions over the past year. And I'll say out of the 8 or so scenarios, it was 50-50. Did they get approval or not? I think it might have depended on the seriousness of the case, or I don't know exactly how the decision was made. I would definitely recommend that the person apply and they ask for it. But again, most of the situations here, especially the moment the UK becomes a high-risk country, you have to go into it assuming, it's not a pleasant feeling to have, but assuming that it will not be granted. What to do in a case where there is a court case and you weren't able to enter, the court system is actually equipped to deal with that on 2 levels, either pushing it off further, or they do have a system of video testimony, which they can put into place as well. The question has come up. In some cases, it's been granted. In some cases, not. I will tell you, I have not had a case where it was from a high-risk country. So I have to imagine that given the fact that people were rejected for a court case, even when it wasn't a high-risk country, that it'll be very difficult once the UK does come into that status. But again, worthwhile to apply, but to be under the assumption that there's very limited chance of receiving that approval.
Okay. We have a lady in the audience this evening who I really sympathise with. Her son's wedding is scheduled for the 9th of August in Israel. She has a flight but no approval. Who can help her? What can she do?
So here's what I'm going to recommend in this situation. I'm very happy that we introduced Ariella Maureen before. I will definitely ask that person go to yadlolim.org. And I want to explain why, though. I want to be very clear. We at Yad L'Olim do not have the power to give approvals. I really wish we did, but we don't. And we sympathize with every one of these situations. What we would want to do in this situation is double check the documentation to make sure that she really has everything in place, and that the reason why she's not hearing back from her application is not because her documentation is somehow faulty. We will check that. At that point, and I want to be very, very clear, out of all the consulates that we've been dealing with over the last year and a half, and in general, the UK has been the most difficult, certainly for me. I can't speak for Ariella Maureen, but for me, in terms of breaking through and getting approvals when necessary. What we will do, though, in that situation is we will turn to a foreign ministry official, and we will at least make them aware of the fact that here is an application which is completely valid in terms of all the documentation, and they're asking to come for a wedding, and we're asking for this to be approved. We don't have the power to make it happen. Understand that they are flooded with literally the consulates. It's over 200,000 applications that are there, and there's a lot of backlog, and we're trying to do our best. So we will try to push, especially in the case of a parent for a child's wedding. But I have to say, we've seen it just over the last few days. We've sadly seen people who wanted to fly here for their children's weddings, and we weren't able to get it done. And I want to emphasize that point. We don't have the ability to push a button and make it happen. We will do whatever we can to try to help. And step one of that is going to yad.org. Let me just explain how it works. You'll see a form on the home page. You fill in that form. In the drop-down, you choose Corona Travel, and then you can explain your request. The best thing to do would be to highlight the fact that, in this case, for example, I have a wedding, my flight is this date, and I'm asking you to review my documentation to make sure that it's okay. And Ariella, Maureen, Rachel, they're going to do their best to get to it and to be in touch with you back and forth and try to make sure the documentation is in place. So again, we cannot promise that you will get that approval. We will do whatever we can to try to let the authorities be aware of it. And like Stephen said, it does break our hearts. It's really, really difficult that people are in that situation, and that we are trying to bring those cases to the attention of the authorities. Just remember, in the case that you mentioned, Stephen, in this particular case, if the flight is August 9th, it's going to be post probably the UK becoming a high-risk country, which means that coming this Friday, July 30th, this woman would have to send in a new application, hiding the fact that it's for her child's wedding, and hopefully, again, the authorities will understand the situation and grant an exception. This is going to be an exception to be able to enter Israel in that situation. She'll have to remember, though, the quarantine. This is really important in terms of the timing. Because once the UK becomes that high-risk country, there's no way to come in and show up at a wedding the next day. You are talking about a minimum of 7 days with a negative PCR test upon arrival and negative PCR test on day 7.
Okay, gosh, it's certainly complex. So got another question here, one of many. So I'm just trying to get as many to you as possible. Someone saying they've been approved for Aliyah. The Sochnut, the Jewish agency, is looking to book a flight for them. One mother is Israeli. The mother is Israeli. The father and kids have Aliyah visas. Will they be able to fly to Israel next week?
The information that I was given today was that Aliyah will continue even if the UK becomes a high-risk country. Now, as you mentioned in your introduction, things are dynamic. Things are changing. Rules are reassessed. So anything that I'm saying right now cannot be viewed as ironclad 100%. But again, based on the information that I was getting, and I really was very deliberate today in sitting down with them because I knew that we were doing this. Aliyah will continue. Exactly how that will work, exactly what flights, those are all details that have to be worked out with the particular Aliyah advisor or representative.
Okay, we have another one here. As New Olim, we have our Israeli ID cards, but not yet the passport. Are we classed as Israelis when seeking to get back to Israel if we come back to London before the UK becomes a red country?
So generally, a person in that situation is given a travel document from the Misrad HaPnim. It's a travel document to allow you to leave Israel because you haven't received a passport yet. They're also allowed to come back into Israel when they have that travel document together with their Aliyah visa in their passport. That's their allowance to come back into Israel. So that's generally how it works. That person is viewed as Israeli. They just don't have all the documentation. And therefore, as Israelis, assuming that they entered the UK with permission, etc., they should be allowed to come back to Israel as Israelis with that documentation, no different than someone who has an Israeli passport. And again, they'd be bound to all the rules in terms of quarantine and the like.
Okay. Someone here, on the Misrad HaPnim's website, they've asked for vaccination certification numbers for the people visiting. Where can they find that? I'm just reading out the question, but presumably that's the number that each of us would have been given at the time of vaccination. Or
are you talking about vaccination in Israel?
They don't make it clear.
Okay, so we've had this issue, and Ariella has been very helpful with this. There are people who have vaccination certificates that don't have a number on it. And Ariella, I'm going to ask you to jump in, to click in, just to, if you can spotlight Ariella for a moment, just to be able to answer that specific issue about the vaccination number. So Stephen, if you can bring Ariella back on.
Yep. With me.
Sure. Thank you.
And let's unmute her.
Okay, so let me explain to you what people are talking about here is the 24-hour entry, pre-flight entry form. That's what that is. Yes, there's a box that says vaccination certificate, and then there are two fields afterwards. The vaccination certificate spot is actually not mandatory, but if you can't get past it, please don't laugh. You write 0000. Okay, that's that one. In terms of the 2 doses, there are 2 mandatory fields for the dates. For everyone except for J&J, that's not a problem. You have the date of your dosage usually on your QR code. For people from Britain, I've seen that it has the specific dates, and you put dose 1 and dose 2. For those of you who've gotten J&J, which I do not believe is applicable to UK, because I think almost all of you have AstraZeneca, you put J&J is only 1 dose. You put the first dose date, and then, believe it or not, jump to 3 weeks or 4 weeks later and put the next one. And they have not accounted for the fact that J&J does not have 2 doses. But that's what you do with the vaccination certificate box. Okay, 0000. That's it.
Thank you so much, Ariel. I appreciate that. And I've seen, by the way, as we've been talking, a lot of people keep asking, does what I'm saying apply to South Africa as well? And the answer is yes. In other words, when I'm talking about the UK becoming a high-risk country, South Africa has been that. For a long time, and therefore anything that I've said now certainly applies to South Africa and its current status. And by the way, it's been a very, very challenging time. It really has been, as people have wanted to travel back and forth and have had family happy occasions and the like, and it has been difficult. But again, I have no own interactions with the authorities, a level of stringency when it comes to high-risk countries, which we haven't seen in a lot of the other dealings that we've had.
Okay, so what forgive me if you've explained this already, but as you've acknowledged, there's been a deluge of information. It's a lot to take in for everyone, including myself. What happens if the UK is not a forbidden country, but a red one? Can we get out of Bidud quarantine with a positive antibodies test?
Okay, so there were terminologies there that were not so clear, not in your question, but just The health ministry official that I spoke to today felt that the colors are unhelpful because it gets people even more confused. And he liked the terminology of high risk country. That is what we're shifting to. The UK right now has already entered into a status, and this is important, where anybody coming from the UK at this point in time does have to do the quarantine, non-Israeli, of the 7 days. That's already the policy in place. Negative PCR when they arrive, the negative PCR on day 7 to get out of that quarantine. So we're talking about from that to a status where travel is barred. That's the way I started to begin with. You have to assume that travel is banned completely. And the whole system that we've had until last Friday, where you arrive in Israel, you take your negative PCR, you take your serological test, you get out, not in play right now because we already entered, the UK already entered the status where it has the automatic 7-day quarantine. So that's where we are now. So for example, if let's say the Knesset decides not to implement the government's decision, which again, I don't see happening at the end of the day, it has already implemented the whole idea of the 7 days. And therefore, it's just not in the high risk level yet, but it already has been elevated in terms of the status of requiring more quarantine. And therefore, the old system, which was in place of you have approval in Israel, take the serological test, you get out of quarantine, that's not in play at this point in time.
Okay. I've got another one here. Would a sibling of a pregnant sister be considered as an exceptional case to enter Israel?
So first of all, I have to say that I sympathize with all of these questions. I really do, because I can understand a sister wanting to be there when her sister gives birth. I really, really do see that and understand that. There's no official policy as to what is qualified as an exception. But based on what we have seen so far with South Africa, that's the only way I can sort of, based on the history that we've seen, that would not be, unless there was an extreme circumstance where somehow you can explain, where God forbid there's a difficult pregnancy, a difficult situation, the sister is the only one who could help, then maybe the dots will be connected and there will be some kind of approval given. But again, everyone has to sort of take a deep breath and internalize the reality that for the most part, these situations will not be allowed. And it's difficult and it's hard and it's challenging for everyone on both sides of the ocean. But I think it's an important mental and emotional shift to go through because it's just the reality. I'm standing here talking to you and I, out of nowhere, but I broke down crying as we during Corona because my sisters weren't there with me, and it came out of nowhere, and it was very emotional, and it's difficult. It's difficult. We're used to a certain way of living, and that's all been thrown into a spiral, which is very difficult to sort of get out of. But I feel that when you get yourself into that mental place of don't assume that when I fill out that form that somehow it's going to happen. And even though I'm very proud to run an organization called Yad L'Olim that's doing whatever it can, don't assume that anyone or any organization can get that approval done. The authorities here are going to be extremely strict about it. And we have to go into it with that mentality, with that perspective. So in the case that you just mentioned right now, specifically, from South Africa, that was not by and large ever allowed during this time that it was a high-risk country, and therefore we could be the same will be the case for the UK.
Okay, we have a gentleman in the audience who says he has less than 6 months left on his Israeli travel document. It's impossible to get through to the embassy in London. As I found out this evening, the soonest appointment one can get at the consulate in London is December. Can he enter Israel on his travel document with less than 6 months left on it?
With his Israeli passport that has less than 6 months?
Well, he's referring to it as his Israel travel document.
Right, I'll tell you why I'm saying that. Israel has a policy that when you're traveling into Israel on a foreign passport, you're not allowed to enter Israel if that foreign passport expires in less than 6 months. And they're extremely strict about that. So that is an issue which we've had because I know that from the United States and maybe the UK as well, people have had an impossible time getting appointments to redo their passports and whatever it is. And that's been a real issue. And Israel will not allow that person to come in that situation. Now, as far as if they have an Israeli passport that's valid, allowed to enter Israel with that valid Israeli passport. And obviously they'll have to take care of extending, renewing, and whatever else it is to make sure that it remains valid. It's not a problem for an Israeli passport, but it's a problem for the foreign passport.
Okay. I've got another question here addressed obviously directly to you, Rabbi Lipman. You talked about a new process with a new link earlier on. Does this apply to I've chosen this because it's quite specific. Does this apply to non-Israeli citizens? What is the process for UK citizens? Do we still send an email to the UK consulate?
So first of all, I'm going to ask Ariella, Maureen, if you're still on here, if you could put in the chat the link for the consulate. Just put it in the chat below so people can see that link just while it's happening live. That would be fantastic. It's one link. It's not an email anymore. It's not an email to the consulate. It's a link that you will click on, and you'll actually see a very clear process in English to enter your information, to enter your documentation. Very, very clear. If we're talking about a situation where it's not high risk, then again, the criteria is very clear. The presumption has to be that we're talking about someone who has a first-degree relative who is living in Israel as an Israeli citizen. That is the assumption you have to deal with. There are other cases which are allowed. For example, someone on a student visa who lives in Israel who is getting married. Their parents, in a general situation, are allowed to come. Someone who's on a student visa who's giving birth in Israel. In a general situation, those parents are allowed to come. But again, the moment we shift into the UK being the high-risk country, all of those general rules are removed completely from the equation, and the assumption is that foreigners are not allowed to enter Israel. If you look, Ariella just posted it. There's in the chat. I think it'd be somewhere around 98 in the chat. Ariella just posted the link that's there for the consulate application. You go there, you follow it very clearly. You have to make sure that you have the documentation that's there. That documentation would be your own passport, the passport or ID card of the Israeli first-degree relative. It would be the documentation to prove the relationship, a birth certificate, anything that you have to connect all the dots together to show the of the relationship. It would be the proof of the insurance, that you have insurance that includes outright. It has to say in the insurance policy. It has to say that it includes COVID-19 for overseas. It has to be there. The isolation affidavit, all of that there, very, very clear in terms of fill out. You make sure that it's all in place, and then you submit it. So all that documentation really has to be in order. And again, even if you're making a request for an exception because the UK has become a high-risk country, even in that case, you do have to make sure that the documentation is really there to show the reason why this is an extreme situation. Maureen is posting various documents that you need. Your flight is something which we certainly recommend, the isolation health declaration. I also want to remind everyone that if anyone is traveling to Israel, you have the approval. You must show a negative PCR test from within 72 hours of your flight to Israel. That is critical. Negative PCR test, not a rapid test, but a negative PCR test from within 72 hours. And that's something which must be done with Israel. When you get to Israel, you'll also, on the ground here, have a PCR test that's taken here. You'll have to show your vaccination certificate. You have to show your recovery document, all of those things to show that you have the right to enter Israel. And again, we'll be posting the link with all the documents as well, so everyone can follow very clearly. And we at Yad L'Olim are available to go review that with you, to make sure that when you are applying, you have all the documentation in place, because they will either reject or not even answer your application if it's failing in any way, lacking in terms of documentation.
Okay, another question here. Whoever's posted it, we have permission from the UK and are booked on, I was going to say B'nai Akiva for BA, British Airways this Thursday, landing around midnight. So what happens if their flight arrives after the UK changes status, or its status is changed, albeit by 5 minutes?
So I asked this question to the health ministry official today, and this was the answer. And again, I'm just repeating the answer. The answer is, it's not based on when the flight takes off, but it's when the flight lands. Flights that are landing in Israel after 12 a.m., assuming that this decision is made, are subject to the rules of a high-risk country. And therefore, that's obviously a very confusing place, because left the UK when it wasn't the high-risk country, and now you're landing. What, am I going to be punished for that? Am I going to be banned? How is that going to work? I am asking everyone, and I'm asking everyone as someone who has spent far too many nights awake when Israel was sending people back to the countries where they came from after arriving here. I'm asking everyone not to be in that situation, not to be in that situation where the flight is landing in that scenario, unless you are an Israeli who has the full right to enter Israel at that point and then go into the full quarantine. But as a foreigner, I'm asking, don't put yourself in that situation. If you could change the flight to earlier, I ask you to please change the flight to earlier, because I cannot look at you now and tell you that you will be absolutely allowed to enter. No, you're asking me, will they make an exception? 12:05, 12:10. I can only tell you what the health ministry official has told me, and therefore that is what you have to go by in making your decisions about these flights.
Okay. Another one. In the UK, children under the age of 16 cannot get vaccinated. Do you have any idea when families with children in the UK will be able to travel to Israel when they have first-degree relatives there?
This has been one of the hardest parts of this whole process for all of us. And that is the realization that there are people who have first-degree relatives, and it's all very legitimate. And we sadly have to tell people that we don't answer to that question. Israel is being extremely strict about allowance of people who are not vaccinated or recovered from corona into the country. And, you know, we heard all these rumors about these dates. It's funny, not funny, but we as a team joked about never mention these dates because it's going to mislead people completely, right? First it was July 1st, and then it was the situation in Israel right now is getting worse. That's the reality on the ground. I was in the Knesset today. They are assuming that in Israel by September 1st, when schools are opening up, they are assuming that we're going to be having 4,000 to 5,000 new cases a day in Israel as our schools are opening up. And therefore, the authorities here, their first focus has to be on Israeli citizens and trying to create a scenario where people can send their children to school and we can function in our country. All of us on both sides of the ocean know the damage that has been done to our children over this last year and a half. And they want to do everything possible that children can go back to school. Important focuses right now.
Absolutely.
And by the way, remember, a lot of those children not vaccinated, certainly the ones that are younger. And therefore, I, at the moment, do not see a date where I can say to you, oh, by this date, I assume those who are not vaccinated will be able to enter Israel. I just don't see that right now. We have to see how the rest of the summer plays out. We have to see how the holiday season goes. We have to see what happens as we now go into the fall, the winter. This is not going away so quickly, and therefore it's important to stay in touch and to understand exactly what's going on. In terms of reaching all of us, just so you can know, certainly just generic email address that you can reach. I don't want to reach anybody specifically. I don't want to give out their specific contact information, but either Ariella, Maureen, or myself, you can certainly go to info@yadlolim.org and say, I have a question to ask Ariella, I have a question to ask Maureen. You can absolutely do that, and we will get that specific question to them. But the best way for us to be in touch with you and track your case and follow up is for you to go to yadlolim.org and fill out that form on the whole page. Yadlolim.org, YADLOLIM.org. Fill out the page. Go to Corona Travel in the drop-down and then it'll come to our team that's working on this specific issue. By the way, parenthetically, if you have children who are living in Israel, who are having issues in other aspects of life, whether it's medical healthcare issues, not corona-specific healthcare, education, legal issues, employment issues. We have teams that are developed for all of that. You can, again, fill out that form on the homepage, and it'll come to the right address so we can help you with those issues. We're forming now a young Olim department. If you have children ages 18 to 30 who made Aliyah, they should keep their eyes open for that. We have Yad L'Olim seniors that's being founded over the next few days. We want to really help people with every possible scenario to help them thrive in Israel. I know that our focus tonight is on Corona travel, and that's what we've zeroed in on, but I just want you to know that we're available for all of that. You can also email me, by the way, at dove@yadlolim.org. If you have any questions at all, I certainly will be available to help. Know that Ariella and Maureen are working non-stop, around the clock. The hours are really not normal for all of us, frankly. My daughter today was asking, are we going to have any chance of a summer vacation? And I don't think the answer is yes, because if any one of us would take off for a 12-hour period of time, I can't even fathom what the intake would look like in terms of people asking. And the truth is that it's our honor to help. We want to be there. We know that people need this, and that's why Yad L'Olim was formed, and we certainly want to be able to continue that assistance. I know that we have to wrap it up in the next few minutes. Stephen, if there's another one or two questions that you want to bring forward, that'd be fine.
Yeah, let me just okay, sorry, I'm just scrolling through.
In the meantime, Ariella, Maureen, if you could post the name of the Facebook group again also, so people can join that Facebook and get lots of updates that way as well.
So there's a family here, and I think you may have answered a similar one earlier, but I'm going to ask it again. A family clearly in Israel, is the fact that our home, jobs and children live in the UK not guaranteed sufficient special circumstances to be given approval to fly back to the UK from Israel?
Let me tell you of a scenario just to bring home this question. There are people who are moving to countries that are high-risk countries. They have jobs there. For whatever reason, they're moving from Israel to there, and they had to go through significant hoops to get approval to travel. One of the things that they're asking for, and I want to emphasize this, we've seen this today 3 times, it's come up today to me, is a letter from an attorney attesting to the fact that you are actually moving to that other country. So that's something which might be helpful if someone's place of living really is in the high-risk country. That is something which you might need is a letter from an attorney, but it's not to be assumed, taken for granted that you'll be able to travel there. That's why I have everything in place, have all the documentation, and this added point of a letter from an attorney showing that you're moving to that other country or that your place of dwelling really is in that high-risk country.
Okay, have you got time for 1 or 2 more?
The question, time for 1 or 2 more, then I actually want to end off with 1 point as well.
Okay, fine. So let's just ask this one. What are the rules of quarantining in a green country and then going to Israel? Would we be able to get a visa? Would you be able to get a student visa or other visa if you have dual nationality from a green country into Israel?
Yeah, sure. Applying for a new visa right now, A status visa, B status, it's almost impossible to get those visas. Student visas, people are applying to consulates and getting the student visa or the program, a yeshiva or seminary, or it could be a university. They can also help with the process of getting that student visa. So that is something which can be done from a green country at this time. But again, if you're talking about somebody who lives in a high-risk country and is just going to the green country for the 2 weeks, it would be very, very difficult in that scenario to pull off getting a full outright student visa. However, you will have the right, after being in that green country for 2 weeks, to apply through the regular channel of that link to apply for approval to enter into Israel. Okay.
So you mentioned about applying to the program itself. So presumably, can they apply? No, they would need their visa before entering Israel, wouldn't they? presumably. It's
Correct.
not a question of flying into Israel and then getting their visa. It's got to come before.
Correct. There's no ability for that at this time. You'd have to have the student visa beforehand or the approval to enter Israel beforehand from that green country.
Sure. Okay. Let's make this the final one. So Lady's daughter is making Aliyah on Monday, the 2nd of August. Does she have to do quarantine in a hotel?
Yeah, so the Aliyah, I assume the question is from the UK.
Yeah, from the UK, yes. Yeah.
Yes. The assumption right now is that someone who's coming in on Aliyah, I'm basing it on what it was for the past year as well in difficult situations. They do have to do full quarantine. They have not made it clear yet. Will that have to be done in a hotel or not? They have not made that clear. So that's something which your Aliyah advisor will be able to explain to you when that time comes. I do know, just from the contact that I've had with families, obviously that would be a difficult scenario. This is just my gut speaking right now, but not based on talking to any government official. I have to imagine that if we're talking about families that are coming and making Aliyah, going into their new homes in Israel, that they will find a way for that quarantine to be done in their homes. This is my presumption right now. I do know that they're working very hard right now on an electronic system, not bracelets. No one get nervous. I want to make sure, not electronic bracelets, but an electronic system to monitor a lot of the quarantine. And that hopefully will create a scenario where people are keeping to the quarantine rules more tightly, which, by the way, between all of us is the source of all of the issues. And if everyone would actually follow the quarantine according to the laws, then we wouldn't have these situations. I just want to end with one point. First of all, again, thank you to everyone for joining. I really thank the Zionist Federation, the World Zionist Organization, for providing this platform for people to get the information that they need. I want to again give a public thank you to Ariella and to Maureen for all the work and the commitment that they have to this cause. And I want to end with one last point. The very fact that we have an organization that's called the Yad L'Olim means that we're living in a time when we have Aliyah to Israel. And I often, and I want to tell you, I go to sleep at night very often crushed, literally crushed, because we weren't able to help people in a certain scenario. It's very painful. It's very difficult. We're dealing with very, very complicated situations and funerals and people who have family illnesses, very emotional time as well. One of the things that I've done, just a very personal thing that I'm sharing right now to cope in these situations, is I just take a step back sometimes and I just remind myself of exactly what the challenge is. That we're blessed to live in a time where we have a state of Israel. We're blessed to live in a time where, for the most part, we can travel back and forth and see one another. We can visit our families in Israel. They can visit us. And that's a scenario which our great-great-great-grandparents couldn't have even dreamed of happening. And even though we're going through this really difficult challenge right now, just to try to keep that perspective, to know that there will be an end at some point to this. It's taking longer than we expected, but to just remind ourselves that if I could say it this way without in any way minimizing the pain that people are feeling, and I'm not trying to minimize it, let this be our challenge as a Jewish people and as a Israel that we're dealing with this. And hopefully that perspective and the recognition that at some point it will end and we'll be able to get back to seeing one another in a much easier fashion, and especially coming to Israel, that you'll have the ability to come back to Israel, to breathe the air of Israel, to breathe the air of Jerusalem freely. Let that be the guiding light that gets us through these very challenging times. And I thank all of you again for your time. Don't hesitate to come to yadlolim.org and reach out to us for anything that we can help you with.
So Rabbi Lipman, before you go, just to double check, and I'm scrolling up and down the chat, and I'm not able to see everything. Have your colleagues Maureen and Ariella shared out the details for any WhatsApp groups and any? I saw earlier they shared the website, but now that we're at the end of the evening, could they perhaps just share them again on the chat group, just so that everyone can see them? Thank you, Maureen. I've just seen you've shared the
Yes, so first of all, the yadlolim.org is without the apostrophe. We're so used to typing it. We're so used to typing it comes out with there you go. Yadlolim.org. So that's our website for anything related to Corona travel or anything else related to Aliyah issues. The Reunite Olim with Families is the name of the Facebook group, Reunite Olim with Families. That's a link right now that Ariella posted.
Yep.
So just become a member of that group. By the way, not only are we posting updates, but people are posting updates all the time, asking questions, and there's a support group of almost 10,000 people that are helping one another. So that's certainly there. Maria's very, very bold and brave and shared her WhatsApp number, which is great. And again, info@yadlolim.org, dove@yadlolim.org. And okay, I see that someone's asking about a South African WhatsApp group. We'd be more than happy to get that started. Certainly send a message to us at info@yadlolim.org, and we'll be in touch about starting that kind of a WhatsApp group as well. And we look forward to hearing from all of you and trying to help all of you as much as possible.
Okay, so what I'll do for everyone here is when we follow up this event with an email, we'll include a transcript of the chat so that it has all the details in there as well. We'll send a recording to you also. Rabbi Lipman, thank you. You and Maureen and Ariella and your team are clearly doing the most amazing work under the most difficult of circumstances. So kol hakavod to you. You are heroes. You know, really, you are heroes, and you're working hard for everyone. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts. I just wanted to say a huge thank you to my colleague, Dalia Hagioff, who has organized this event with you for this evening. Dalia, thank you very much. It was a great call, like all of your calls are great. So thank you very much. Thank you, Rabbi Lipman. Thank you, Ariella. Thank you, Maureen. Take care.
Can I say one more thing?
Absolutely. Please do.
We have a young man who's interning for us named Jonah Lazarus from the UK, and he's done wonderful work. And I'll just give a congratulations to the entire community for producing a young man who's able to help us so much. It was important for me to mention that.
So much nachas for his parents and the community, for sure, definitely. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. As I've said, we'll follow this up with a recording, the transcript. And, from me, from Dalia, from the whole ZF team and the WZO, thank you for joining. And we really hope that you can somehow realize your travel plans and your travel aspirations. Please God, we'll be back to normal before too long. But we all have to do our part for this, unfortunately, if that's the way it is. Okay, thank you. God bless. And thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Laila Tov.
Bye-bye. Laila Tov.